Well, good evening. Can you hear me? Yeah. I've been at faculty conferences for 2 days in a row. I've listened to about 8 or 9 speeches. I can hardly stand the sound of my own voice because I've listened to so many speeches. Kenneth, Kenneth Hawley had the line of the day, in my opinion. We were like on our 9th speech. It was Dave Fray's. And I don't know if y'all know Dave Fray's, but he's just going and going and going and going. And his PowerPoint went off, and he lost his train of thought. And then he said, "What was I just saying?" And Kenneth, without missing a beat, shouted out, "In conclusion." So if you hear Kenneth do that 10 minutes into this, you'll understand why, where he's coming from. I might do it too, especially if it's going badly. I'm mentally spent. So I appreciate any prayers for me as I begin to speak. So quick word on the origin of this series. As David said, it's going to be on the Oikos, or the house or household of God. I should tell y'all, I teach at LCU, teach Bible majors, and I tell all the Bible majors, do not talk about Greek unless you have to. Not just sermons, but teaching. It's really, there's no need for it unless you just have to. And this is being recorded, and I'm afraid my majors are going to go online and see me breaking the rule I gave them. In my defense, though, what I want to say, this wasn't my idea. This series arose from a conversation with Scott. Scott and I talk from time to time, and he asked a really interesting question, and it was a good question because it kind of changed my own perspective on the Gospel of Mark in a sense. He said, and Scott, you can correct me or hone, my memory is vague, but something along the lines of, is the gospel ever expressed in terms of, and I can't remember if you said family or God's fatherhood. Fatherhood, yeah, you used, it was God's fatherhood. Is the gospel, that's a big question. Sure, God's fatherhood is a theme that shows up in the Bible, but is the gospel ever expressed as God's fatherhood? Initially, I was like, not really. And I went into a quick spiel. I can't remember if I did it aloud or if it was in my mind, but I know I didn't agree at first. I said, no, not really. In fact, when you read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, the central metaphor is God's kingdom. It's what Tolkien and Lewis remind us the gospel is in their storytelling. It's about New Exodus. We're all in the great captivity, just like the children of Israel were in Egypt, slaves ruled by an evil king, ruled by Pharaoh, and God comes and delivers us out of captivity. We walk through the desert. We are pilgrims. We're led by Christ, the shepherd, in the great new Exodus through the wilderness, and we arrive in a new political order called the kingdom of God, where God reigns as king. So kingship, God as king, is what I initially thought in response to Scott's good question. But then I thought, well, one of the major themes in Mark is the oikos of God. And the reason I use the Greek word is because we don't really have an English word that perfectly translates it. I've used 2 words already, house and household. And those words are similar, they overlap, but they mean different things, right? Well, the Greek word oikos kind of means house, family, household, and estate, kind of all rolled into one. And even more than family. It's more than just so let me back up. They use the word oikos, also oikia, to refer to the building that you live in, like our English word house. The actual house where your family lives. But they also use it to refer to the people that are in that building, what we would call family. But in a Greco-Roman world, that's a bigger group. It's not just the nuclear family. It's often many extended relatives. It also includes slaves. And that's going to be a very important part of Mark's reflection on what it means to be the household of God. So it's not just sons and daughters, it's also slaves. Men and women who are slaves, their children who are slaves. They belong to the household as slaves. but it also includes the property that's owned in that estate or that oikos. It's the oikos, and it's and not just the stuff that you see in the building of the house, but if you have fields in an agrarian society, you might have fields that you own. Those fields are part of the oikos. We would never say fields are part of my house or part of my household. We'd say they're part of our estate, maybe. So we don't really have a word in English that perfectly corresponds. So what I said to Scott initially was, there is throughout the Gospel of Mark, and then Luke and Matthew also pick up on this, there's this constant recurring portrait of the house in which Jesus and his disciples gathered. And this is, for early Christians, a way of reflecting on what it means to be the family of God. And the more I've thought about it since our initial conversation, I did say, this does give some expression to the gospel. I now kind of think, because Scott made me think about this question, I now would say oikos is just another way of speaking of the kingdom. God as Father is just another way of speaking of God as King. In the Greco-Roman household, the pater familias was kind of the ruler, and he ruled the wife or the wives, the children, and the slaves, and he was kind of the owner of everything. And so what does it mean to have God as Father, as pater familias? It's just another way of saying he's creating a new kind of rule, a new kind of world that we live in as his children. And it's closely tied to the theme of New Exodus, which we're going to see tonight, of God's coming kingdom, the notion of God's. I'm going to start saying God's house or household. I'm not going to say oikos all night, but understand that when I say that, I mean more than what our English word means by that. Yeah, fair? We can start using the word house and household for the rest of the night. All right. So, why was the word so important for early Christians? It partly has to do with their lived experience. We know from the Gospels that Jesus predicted something that would happen to them post-Easter, post-resurrection, the followers of Jesus. He told them, you're going to get kicked out of the synagogues. And it may kind of surprise you if you think about that. What does that mean? It means the early Christians initially worshiped not in churches or not even in houses. They worshiped in synagogues. The early Christian movement didn't see itself as a new religion. In fact, that's kind of anachronistic. They saw themselves as the heirs of the ancestral faith. The earliest Christians were Jews. They worshiped in the synagogue, and they believed the Messiah had come. Jesus was the Messiah. That's what they taught their fellow Jews. And this became such a point of contention that eventually these Jewish Christians were persecuted and kicked out of the synagogues by their religious leadership. And so they were kind of cut off from the synagogues in which they had worshiped all their lives. Also from the temple. You remember, in Acts, where did the early church first worship? In the temple, in the porch of Solomon, right? Christians didn't meet in a separate place from other Jewish sects. In fact, in the book of Acts, everybody calls the Christian movement a sect of Judaism. Even the Christians themselves talk about the sect of our larger religion. So this was a painful event. Imagine being Jewish all your life, and you become a follower of Jesus the Messiah. You want to persuade your fellow Jews that Jesus is the promised king, the promised Messiah, and this ends up costing you everything. You're cut off from your community. If you're outside of Jerusalem, if you're living in one of the major cities of the Roman world, you've only lived in a Jewish neighborhood all your life. Think of that. It's like someone who's raised in Chinatown in New York City being Chinese and just kind of living as a Chinese person in a Chinese culture in the middle of New York, suddenly being kicked out of that culture. This was a painful, traumatic event for early Christians. And how did they respond to this? Jesus was already preparing them. He was already teaching them together in houses, not just in the synagogue. And he was teaching them that in a way the house is the new synagogue. One last thing about synagogues. The word synagogue, I told you I wasn't going to talk about Greek much, but very quickly, because it's important, it kind of gets lost in our English translation. The word synagogue simply means a gathering place, a gathering place. It's from the Greek word sunago. You can hear that in the word synagogue, right? Sunago, synagogue. And it wasn't called a synagogue just because Jews gathered there to worship. It was also called a synagogue because they were living the narrative of new Exodus. When God led the first children of Israel out of their Exodus, repeatedly in the Old Testament narrative, God is pictured gathering them like a flock and leading them on the way through the wilderness. It's preparation for entrance into the promised land and entrance into God's kingdom. So when they called their houses synagogues, gathering places, it wasn't just to say a generic kind of gathering, but a particular kind of gathering, the kind of gathering that our forefathers experienced when they were undergoing the Exodus. Why? Because we are about to undergo the new Exodus. Jews first developed synagogues when they were in captivity in Babylon. They didn't have synagogues until the Babylonians came and conquered them and carried them off into captivity. They lost the temple. They lost temple-centric worship. So what did they start doing? They started creating gathering houses centered not around sacrifice, but around Torah, around the law. And they started calling these gatherings because they expected God would gather us like he did in the first Exodus, lead us out of captivity and onto the promised land, onto God's kingdom. All right, keeping that in mind, we can finally come. Thank you so much for a lengthy introduction. You're patient, attentive. I congratulate you. Now let's read Scripture. Let's turn to Mark chapter 1. And what I want to do is just look at the very first 4 passages where the house shows up in Mark. Turn to Mark chapter 1. Let's see. Let's start in verse 29. Where does the very first healing in Mark occur? Or the very first exorcism in Mark occur? You look at the verses immediately preceding verse 29, you'll see it happens in a synagogue, right? Jesus casts out the demon in the synagogue. Now, let's start reading in verse 29. As soon as they left the synagogue, they went with James and John into, my translation says the home, that's the word oikos, the house of Simon and Andrew. Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with fever. All right, so this is a woman who's Peter's mother-in-law. This is Peter's mother-in-law. She's probably a widow. Women married much older men at this time. She's the oldest person in the household, and in many ways the most esteemed in the household. Simon's now the head of the household, but she's going to be the esteemed, in terms of hierarchy, she's the highest member of this household we've just entered. She's the most important, or at least most esteemed member of this household. Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they told Jesus about her. So he went to her. Now I want you to, Mark's narration of events is often quite symbolic. I just want you to imagine this event, this series of steps, and I want to ask you if it reminds you of anything. He took her by the hand, and in the Greek it says literally he raised her. Took her by the hand, he raised her, and the fever left her, and she began to serve them. So she is fevering. She's lying down, fevering. Jesus takes her by the hand, he raises her, and then she begins to serve. Does the raising kind of remind you of anything? Does it bring to mind anything in your mind? What does the word raise bring to mind? The resurrection of Christ. And that word's going to be used over and over and over in multiple healings in Mark. This is like a visual image of the resurrection. And what does this person who's been raised by Jesus do? Serves. You don't expect that from the mother-in-law. There are servants, slaves in a household that are supposed to serve. And if they don't have slaves, there are children who are supposed to serve. There are lesser relatives who are supposed to serve. This is the most important person in a household taking on the role of the least important person in the household, a maid servant girl. This is really important in the gospel because we get to the end of Mark, Jesus, as he's heading to the cross, is going to tell these male disciples of his who want to be the most important in his kingdom, whoever wants to be first will be last of all, and servant, or he uses the word slave of all. So from day one, we have a disciple, this woman, who models what it means to be a member of God's household. All, no matter their position, are slaves. We're all slaves to one another, willingly. Look at the very next sentence. That evening, after sunset, the people brought to Jesus all the sick and demon-possessed. The whole town, y'all have the word gathered there? The whole town gathered at what's the Greek word for gathered again? Synagogue. So Jesus and his followers have left the synagogue, but now in the house of Peter and Andrew, all the disciples, and in addition to them, the whole town is now being gathered into this household. This is pretty remarkable. We've actually excavated this house. We humans have. If you take a trip to Israel, go to the city of Capernaum, and this is just like an unexpected surprise that occasionally archaeology will produce something just remarkably wonderful. Right across the street from the synagogue is this ancient early Christian house in Capernaum. We know it was a Christian house because they found Eucharist or Lord's Supper imagery on a table that was in the center of the house, but they also knew it was like a normal house. That's the first church building ever. That's the first gathering place of Jesus' followers. We know that it continued to be a church building after Jesus was resurrected and ascended. So what's already happening in Jesus' life, Mark's telling the story in a way that foreshadows his Christian readers' own experience of leaving synagogue, the old gathering place, and they're learning something about what it is to be part of the household of God. This is the new gathering place. Notice also it says that evening after sunset, they brought people to Jesus, all the sick. The whole town gathered at what do your translations say there? Door. That's a good translation, but the word there can also mean gate. So what does the image of it's evening and now there's a gathering of the whole town at the gate? What does that combination of images bring to mind? Shepherding. I watched my Uncle Mac in the Texas Hill Country. He had sheep out back. I didn't know a thing about sheep until I went to go visit him and learned that in the morning he leads them out. In the evening, he just walks out to the pen. They look up and they start running toward him, and they come gather to him at the gate of the sheep pen. And this is going to be a recurring scene in Mark. The townspeople keep gathering at the gate. What is this saying about Jesus when he's pictured, when the people are pictured, the people of town are pictured gathering at the gate in the evening? What does it say about Jesus? He's the good shepherd. He's the great shepherd. He's the great shepherd of the new Exodus, just as God was in the first Exodus. For him to be shepherd means that this is the new Exodus gathering. He also drove out many demons, but he would not let the demons speak because they knew who he was. All right, skip down to 2 verse 1. Chapter 2 verse 1. This is the second time the household is mentioned. And once again, we've just left synagogues in Galilee. There's just been another exorcism of sorts. The story of the healing of the leper is told like an exorcism. Jesus cast the leprosy out. They leave the synagogues, and where do they go the second time they've left synagogues? House. Look at 2 verse 1 and following. A few days later, when Jesus again entered Capernaum, the people heard that my translation says the people heard that he had come home. How do we want to translate this? If you translate it literally, you can guess what it says. They entered the household. They entered the house. So many gathered there. There's our word again. Now the townspeople are once again gathering at the house. So many people were gathered there. There was no room left, not even outside the gate. Once again, Jesus is being portrayed as kind of a shepherd, and he's gathering all of these Jewish people to his household. And again, a healing happens. Again, the healing is like a resurrection. You have a paralytic man who's lying down. 3 times the word raise is used, and he's lifted up. Skip down to the 3rd time we see the word house. This is going to be just a few verses later, the calling of Levi. You'll see that in verse 13. Let's read there, chapter 2, verse 13. Once again, Jesus went out beside my translation says lake. Do y'all have the word lake there? If your translation reads sea, that's actually a better translation. The Lake of Galilee was called a Lake of Galilee by everybody. Mark was the first person to come along and call it the sea. Why do you think Mark called it the sea? Red Sea, it's evoking Exodus. Mark has his disciples following Jesus by the sea, in the desert, and on mountaintops. It's wilderness, it's journey. So here he is by the sea, and a large crowd, my translation says came to him. Literally, the Greek says a large crowd was gathered to him, and he began to teach them. And as he walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector booth. All right, take that in for a second. What do y'all know? You know about tax collectors, right, in this world. What are some things we need to know about these tax collectors, Jewish tax collectors in the Roman world? What do we want to say about them? That's true of tax people today. What else do we want to say about them? And I know where Dale is going with this. They weren't respected. David says they were traitors. I think y'all are seizing upon this. Why were they traitors? And what do you mean by the other side? The government, which is the Roman government, and David says oppressors. Imagine if the Russians had conquered America, and then I go down and start working for the Russians, and I show up to your door, and then I take taxes for the Russians. What else did they do when they came to your door and took taxes for their version of the Russians? I'm sorry? That's a kind way of putting it. They actually enriched themselves. They were like Judas, religious traitor, and Benedict Arnold, political traitor, all rolled into one. What job should Levi have had? His name is Levi. You only get that name if you're from the tribe of Levi. He should have been a priest. This is like David going and working for the Russians when they conquered. You're supposed to be a holy man, and you're getting rich you're joining in the oppression, and you're selling out your countrymen, you're selling out your religion. You know, we give the Pharisees a hard time. It would be really hard for me not to feel exactly like the Pharisees did about this guy. I imagine most of us, I know I would have felt like, this guy is unredeemable. Go ahead, David. I'm going to steal that, David. That's a great analogy. A Jew working for the Nazis. Yeah. It's outrageous. We lose sight of just how outrageous and evil what Levi has done with his life really is. Well, Jesus sees him, and we're so conditioned by Jesus' love, we know what's going to happen. But let's appreciate what a radical thing Jesus is doing. When Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners. Oh, I skipped a line, didn't I? And as he walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting in the tax collector booth. Follow me, Jesus told him. And Levi got up and followed him. The last time we saw people following Jesus by the sea, it was the first disciples, Peter and Andrew, the esteemed founders of the Christian movement. Now, Jesus is calling this guy. He's probably a part of the Markan community. He's probably known as a Christian by this time. When Mark uses the names of people, it's often people that are, now kind of known to the community. This is Levi's story. Levi got up and followed him. What does that mean? To follow, to be gathered to Jesus and to follow. He is starting the new Exodus, just like those first Jews who were called by the sea, just like Peter and John who were first called by the sea. Peter, James, and John and Andrew called by the sea. While Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, there it is again. So this place of gathering that we've been talking about was a house. Many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him. What by sinner, they don't mean what we quite mean. A sinner was someone who just didn't keep Torah, didn't keep the law of Moses. They were Jews, but they weren't living like Jews. They were living like Greeks. They would call them Hellenists, or worse. Even many Hellenists, like Greek-like Jews, kept the law. A sinner doesn't even keep the law. So these are also people that are outside of Jewish society. They are rejected. Tax collectors, sinners. They are unholy. And if they're unholy, what does that mean? For you, if you're a practicing Jew who keeps the law, what does that mean for your relationship with that person? What can't you do specifically with this person? You can't enter their house. Why? It's unclean. What do we mean by, and don't think modern, right? Like it's unsanitary, right? You know what we mean by that. It's unholy. You become unholy. You become unclean when you enter that household. So the expectation when Jesus goes into this house with these unholy people, they're not keeping kosher, they're not eating like a Jew should eat. The expectation is Jesus and his followers have now become unholy. All the more because what does Jesus do when he gets in there? He eats with them. Are you supposed to have table fellowship with a Gentile or a non-Torah keeping Jew? No. To share the bread of a sinner or a tax collector is to become unholy. What we're seeing in the household of God are the rules of holiness being overturned. You would think that coming into contact with the sinner and the tax collector makes Jesus unholy, but instead his holiness extends to them when he enters their house. His holiness extends to them when he breaks bread with them. It's like the rules of holiness have been reversed with this powerful man, Jesus. When the teachers of the law and the Pharisees saw him eating with sinners and tax collectors, they asked his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And y'all can understand that question. I think we can kind of view that question sympathetically. On hearing this, Jesus said to them, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous." Okay, now he unpacks the metaphor, right? The metaphor is doctor and patient, doctor and sick patient. But then he unpacks the metaphor. I have not come to call the righteous. Who would the righteous be? The Pharisees, the healthy, right? But sinners. Who are the sinners in the metaphor? The sick. Not only does Jesus, justify his eating with Levi, what is that saying about the Pharisees? They're not too good. They're not invited on the new Exodus. They're not called the way Levi was called at the sea. They're not called the way Peter, James, Andrew, and John. Peter, Andrew, James, and John. They're not called the way they were at the sea. It sounds like Jesus initially is just kind of justifying his fellowshipping with sinners, but he's actually in a subtle way critiquing the Pharisees. I've come to call them, but it's also true, I've not come to call you. What are we learning about the household of God from this story? What's that? A lot. This is what's wonderful about narrative. It can say so much through storytelling that if you start kind of unpacking it, it takes a list of boring prepositions, right? Propositions, I should say. Propositions with prepositions. It involves a lot of unpacking, but there's some pretty major things that are being said about the household, right? Yes, Dale? You have to choose. Only one is the true gathering for the new Exodus. Only one place is the place where God is gathering people. And it's not the synagogue anymore. It's now this house where God's gathering. So you can imagine how incredibly encouraging that was for Christians who'd been kicked out of the synagogue. This is saying to them, you don't need that. You have this. This is the true gathering place. It also says some pretty obvious things about whom we should welcome, right? We are a place that welcomes whatever the worst, whatever the most marginal, whatever the most outcast, whatever the most unholy there is in our world around us. This is the place where we, the sick, are welcome. And we're welcomed by God, but we're welcomed by God through his people. My watch was destroyed by Schlitterbahn water, so I have to check I'm not checking for messages on purpose. 7:25, is that what we're aiming for here, David? About around there? Okay. Let's look at the fourth story. And this is the story I want to spend the rest of my time today. We're going to keep looking at household stories. That's for the next couple of weeks after this. But the last one, I want to spend some time here. It's in chapter 3. Skip down to, where is it? Verse 20. And I want to read this entire story. It's 3:20 through the end of the chapter. We're going to read it piecemeal. 3:20 through verse 35. This is our main passage for the night. 3:20 through 35. A couple of things about this before we read. This is what scholars, in a very academic way, refer to as a Markan sandwich. They call it a Markan sandwich, very technical term. What do they mean by that? Mark loves to take two stories and sandwich one inside the other. Mark does this everywhere. He loves to take two stories and kind of insert one inside the other and kind of just juxtapose them and asks you to kind of think about why he's telling these two stories in such a closely related way. It happens over, I thought you were raising your hand, Kenneth. It's like an auction in here. You do this, I call on you. I think we're going to have time to read 2 or 3 other Markan sandwiches together in the next couple of weeks. Here we have story A, the story of Jesus' own family members falsely accusing him. But then we also have story B, and it's, not surprisingly, quite similar. It's the story of the Jewish religious leadership falsely accusing Jesus. And the way these sandwiches work is Mark will tell the first story, story A. He'll tell it all the way up to the tension of the story, the narrative tension. But he won't resolve it. before he gets to the resolution of that story, then he tells story B in its entirety. And often the tension of that story is very similar to the tension of story. He'll tell story B in its entirety, and then he comes back to story A and finishes story A. That's what Mark does. He invents this kind of, I don't know if he invents it, but certainly does it more than any of the other gospel writers. We see this in movie making. One example I like to use is in the Oscar-winning film, The Godfather. It's a tragedy. It's a terrible story about how the son of a mafioso wants to escape the criminality of his family and live a good life, but he gets sucked back in, and he ends up becoming the Godfather, the head of the crime family. And in the movie, the scene where this happens is two scenes. He's inside the church, Catholic Church, the Italian Catholic Church, being baptized on behalf of his infant nephew. He's becoming godfather in the Catholic tradition. He's becoming godfather to this child inside the church. Meanwhile, outside, his henchmen are shooting the other heads of the criminal families in New York. What's happening on the outside? He's becoming godfather. What's happening on the inside? He's becoming godfather. It's a terrible scene. This is the moment in the movie where he becomes what he never wanted to be. Two different scenes, and the director juxtaposes it, inside, outside, inside, outside, inside, outside. And why is he doing this? He's wanting you to see how what happens inside the church is also what's happening outside the church. This is where Michael breaks bad, where Michael turns into an evil criminal for good. That's the way what we experience visually, in that we're a very visual culture. Ancients experienced in this sandwiching technique through the ears. Yes, Dale. Not me, Michael Corleone. Yes. I would be a terrible godfather. I would just be incompetent. So let's read story A, then story B, and then we'll come back to story A, okay? Story A begins in verse 20. And not surprisingly, then Jesus entered a house. And again, notice Mark uses the word again. He wants to remind you, I've told you this before. And again, a crowd, what's the word here? Gathered, so that he and his disciples were not even able, my NIV says, not even able to eat. Do you have a translation that's more explicit? Not able to eat. Is that all your English translations say that? Oh, really? I assumed that it was just this translation. The Greek doesn't say not able to eat. The Greek says he was not able to eat bread. Your translators figure that's just, the word bread can often mean food, so they just kind of throw that word away as we don't need that. But actually you do, if you think about what it means to be part of the new Exodus gathering. What does the flock that Jesus gathered eat in the new Exodus? Bread. And we're going to see Jesus reenacting the whole bread miracle, first with a Jewish crowd, then with a Gentile crowd later in this story. And repeatedly, the house is going to be framed as a place where you're supposed to eat bread. That's something else. In one sentence, what has Mark said about communion? In one sentence, he's reminded us that our communion meal is the meal where we experience the manna from heaven as we undertake our wilderness journey. So, he was not able to eat bread, and when his family heard about this, I'm going to break my Greek rule again because there's a wonderful play on words that we're going to get to in this story. It's a marvelous, clever little play on words that Mark expects his Greek readers to enjoy, and we lose it in our English translations. Okay, there's not a word for family in Greek. The way they say family are the ones peri you, around you. Peri, our word perimeter, peri. The ones around you. So you might speak of your children or your parents or your cousins or your slaves as the one peri you. This refers to the members of the household, the people of the household. So remember that phrase, the ones peri you. I want you to remember that little Greek phrase, the ones around you, the ones peri you. Peri him. When those parry him, those around him, heard about this, they went to, the word here is seize. Where do we see that word used again in this gospel? To seize. When they take Jesus away. In fact, the word means to seize or to arrest. Long before Jesus is finally seized in the gospel, his own family members were attempting to seize or arrest him, take him into legal custody. For they said, and here's a second little Greek phrase I want you to use. It's very similar to our English. What do your translations say here? Out of his mind. That's a really good translation. He's out of his mind. The way you say someone's crazy in Greek, it's kind of a cool way of saying it. Their idiom, which is, their idiom is, oh, that person is standing outside himself. That person's standing out. Every language has its own idiom for being crazy. Spanish, loco in the cabeza, right? Crazy in the head. Head jumped. Like you translate that literally in English, it doesn't make much sense, although you can kind of intuit, It's very similar, actually, to standing outside himself. It's very similar to our phrase, out of his mind. That's a good English idiom. I want you to remember that. So those parry him, around him, are accusing him of standing outside himself. That's the idiom, being crazy. Okay, that's story A. Do we get the resolution of story A? Not yet. Now we switch to story B. All right, story B. And the teachers of the law who came down from Jerusalem. Now, I think this is the first time we have Jerusalem leadership coming up to Galilee. Up to this point, all the Jewish leaders have been local Galileans. This is the first time Jesus encounters Jewish teachers of the law. These are Bible professors. I like to say that the Bible professors are always the bad guys in the Bible, pretty much. I hate to say it, but it's true. There's something about this. These are the Bible professors. They're experts in the Scriptures. And they know there are verses that condemn exactly what Jesus has been doing in the Scriptures, eating with sinners, going into the house of sinners. It's very clear. If you just follow the text, take it literally, and follow the rules without any thought for the spirit of it or without any thought of its place in the larger narrative of God's history, it's very easy to condemn Jesus. Well, they come down from Jerusalem. And they said, what? What's their accusation? Someone's in his mind. He's possessed by Beelzebul. And David's right. To be crazy, to be accused of being crazy in their world, is not like ours. We have sympathy for people who have, mental illness. Not in their world. Mental illness was closely associated with demon possession. It's virtually the same accusation in many ways. This person is evil powers are kind of, you may be an innocent victim, but evil powers have kind of controlled you through possession or through craziness. What's Mark showing us? His own family makes a very similar kind of terrible accusation that Jesus' worst enemies make. Now, the enemies make two accusations, don't they? He's possessed by Beelzebul, Satan. What's the second accusation? He's empowered by him, right? And so he is possessed by Beelzebul, and by the prince of demons, he is driving out demons. So two accusations. This guy's demon-possessed. He's not just demon-possessed, he's Satan-possessed. And he's using Satan's power to cast out other demons. No one can deny that Jesus has power over the demons. He's casting out demons in every synagogue he goes to, in every town he goes to. You can't deny his power. So what do? You undermine it by saying, oh, he has power, but he gets that power from the one that possesses him, Satan himself. All right, that's the tension of story B. we go right to the resolution of story B. Jesus is going to address first the accusations of the religious leaders. He's going to take them up in reverse order. What was the last accusation? Not possessed, empowered. That's the last accusation. The demons empower him. He's going to start with that one. So it's kind of like a little chiasm too. Accusation 1, accusation 2, accusation 3, and then Jesus just systematically dismantles accusation 3. And then accusation 2, and then finally we arrive back at story A, accusation 1. That's the way this story is structured. Mark loves his chiasms. Mark structures narratives in this kind of ABC, CBA pattern everywhere, and it's got really well told there. Anyways, so Jesus called them and spoke to them in parables. So he calls these religious leaders. And he speaks to them in parables. Now, in Mark, that's a bad thing. Jesus, in Mark, speaks to outsiders in parables. Later on, in the very next chapter, he's going to say he does that to cause blindness and deafness. But then what does Jesus do with his own followers? They go inside the house, and he explains what the parables mean. So if Jesus is talking to you in parables and he doesn't take you inside the house and explain what it means, you're an outsider in Mark. So he speaks to them in parables, and he asks, how can Satan cast out Satan? And then 3 little proofs, 3 little sayings. If a kingdom is divided against itself, the kingdom can't stand. Y'all follow the logic? This is nuts to say I'm using Satan to cast out demons. If Satan were doing this, he'd be dividing his own kingdom. He'd be making his own kingdom fall. And then notice the second one. If an oikos, a house, is divided against itself, it cannot stand. Satan would never cast out demons. That would be dividing not just his own kingdom, but his own house. Scott, here where we see the house and kingdom being used almost as parallel notions. But we're talking here not about God's house, God's kingdom. We're talking about Satan's house, Satan's kingdom. And what is the new Exodus out of? Satan's rule, Satan's kingdom, Satan's house. It's deliverance from that house, that kingdom, into God's house, God's kingdom. Then the third, if Satan opposes himself and is divided, he cannot stand, and his end has come. So Jesus quite effectively addresses the accusation he's empowered by Satan. This makes no sense. If Satan were casting out demons, he'd be causing his own kingdom to fall, his own house to fall. He'd be causing himself to fall. Notice also we're learning what Jesus is doing. What is Jesus actually doing? He's not a member of Satan's household, but what is he doing? When he casts out demons, he is destroying Satan's kingdom. He's plundering it. He's destroying Satan's household. He's plundering. He's taking people. He's destroying Satan himself. And that's the point he makes next. In fact, no one can enter a strong man's oikos, a strong man's household, and carry off his possessions unless he first ties up the strong man. Then he can rob his house. Pause right there. Y'all know Jesus is a robber, a thief, right? What does he do? What's that? Harrows hell. Leave it to the English professor to reach for that language. Yes, he is like a thief who breaks into Satan's house, ties him up, and plunders his house, steals his possessions. In this metaphor, what are the possessions Jesus is stealing? People. When he casts out those demons, he is taking his property back from Satan. We're learning something about what it means to the household of God. We're all Jesus' plunder. We were helpless. We were under Satan's captivity in Satan's house, and Jesus came, and thankfully he stole us into his household. That's accusation 3. What was accusation 2? Not that he's empowered by Satan, but what? Possessed. Now we come to accusation 2. Jesus is possessed by Beelzebul. Notice what he says next. I tell you the truth, all the sins and blasphemies of men will be forgiven them. But whoever blasphemes against, blaspheme means to slander or speak falsely. Whoever, in an unholy way, whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit will never be forgiven. He is guilty of an eternal sin. Now you may be wondering, why is Jesus saying these words at this point? Mark anticipates that you may be wondering this, so Mark explains why Jesus said it. Look at the very next sentence. He said this because they were saying he has an evil spirit. Okay, let's back up. Why does Jesus start talking about blaspheming the Holy Spirit? Hey, you blaspheme the Spirit of God, the Holy Spirit, you will never be forgiven. Who has blasphemed the Spirit in this story? Yes, the teachers of the law. How have they blasphemed the Holy Spirit? By saying Jesus is possessed, the Son of God is possessed by Beelzebul. What is Jesus possessed by? A different spirit, the Holy Spirit. We saw that Spirit descend upon him at the beginning of the story of Mark at his baptism. Yes, Jesus does have a spirit within him. Yes, that spirit does cast out demons. But when you call that spirit Beelzebul, Satan, you are calling God Satan. And Jesus is saying, that's the unforgivable sin. I feel like my pastoral duty is to say to you, none of you are committing that sin just by virtue of the fact you're here. Don't worry. You haven't committed the unforgivable sin. And we also know this. There were Pharisees and the teachers of the law who stopped that blasphemy and were welcome into the Christian household. Yes, Dale. Right. To call Jesus' spirit Beelzebul is to remain aligned with the kingdom of Satan instead of to be aligned with the kingdom of God, to be part of Satan's household, to not be. As long as you're part of Satan's household, you stand outside of the blessings of the new Exodus. Yeah. I think when I read this for, college students, they can worry so much that they're guilty of this sin. And I was raised in a context by wonderful people in a wonderful little Church of Christ, but we were pretty legalistic, and I lived kind of in terror of none of us are committing that sin. The point of this is to say this accusation amounts to something horrific. To say Jesus is possessed by Satan. Jesus is exposing just what a terrible lie that is. It's blasphemy of God, God's self. And that brings us back to the family accusation. What are we already learning about the family accusation? It's also just as terrible. Now we return to story A. What was the accusation the family made? He's crazy. What was the phrase? What's the Greek phrase for being crazy? Standing outside himself. And the family. What's the word? What's the phrase for the family? Parry him, around him. So the ones around him, the ones parry him, said he's standing outside himself. Now we come back to story A. And there's a little bit of delicious, funny Markan irony here. I've lost my place. What verse are we in? 31. Then Jesus' mother and brothers arrived. And standing outside, they sent someone in to call him. Who's standing outside Jesus? Not Jesus himself. Jesus isn't standing outside him. Who's literally standing outside? It's his family members. They're the ones who are crazy. And notice, they're not in the household. They're his mothers and his brothers. But that doesn't mean they are in his household. and a crowd was sitting around. Should we be surprised that a crowd is now gathered in the household? No, this is what we've seen over and over. A crowd was sitting around him, and my translation said around him. That's not quite right. The Greek says not parry him. The Greek says para him. It's a play on words, another play on words. It means to be the ones beside him. The ones beside him. Oh, I got it. Everything I said about parry and para is all wrong. I got it mixed up because I don't have my Greek text in front of me. I told you completely wrong, and I'm ruining it. The phrase for family is not the ones around you. The phrase for family is the ones beside you. I got it completely backwards because I was reading an English text. The family phrase is the ones beside you. Para him. Now we get a very similar phrase. It's the one I initially used. Parry him. Now we see the ones who are around him. Parry him. And they told him, your mothers and brothers are looking for you. Then he looked at those seated in a circle, parry him, not para him, parry him, around him, and said, here are my mothers and brothers. Whoever does God's will is my brother and sister and mother. What is Jesus saying about the household of God with that final sentence? There's lots of good ways to summarize it. Don't search for the correct answer. So many good things could be said, but how would you summarize what Jesus is saying about the house? The people who are gathered around him, as we are this evening, right? We are here gathered around Christ. And what does that mean we are? We're the household. We're the family. We're not the ones para him, the usual phrase for family. We're the ones parry him, the ones around him. The Christian phrase, one I should probably remember. The Christian phrase for family. So how do you spot your brother and sister? Look around you. And then it's also those who are doing his will. To gather in the house with sinners and tax collectors is to be the people that are doing the will of God. And in Mark, that is walking the path of due exodus, out of captivity into God's reign. For next time, we're going to read a few more household stories, and Mark has some other really wonderful things to say about what it means to be the household, the family of God. Thank you all for your kind interaction. I hope to keep this very conversational and not, thank you for getting me down here on the floor, not in the pulpit, David. Thank you.